Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
While I was in the hospital, my husband brought his mistress home. I found out through my neighbor and checked out a day early. When I arrived and opened the door, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say you never really know someone until something goes wrong. I used to think that was just something bitter people told themselves. I was wrong. My name is Laura Hendricks. I was 38 years old, living in a 3-bedroom house in suburban Columbus, Ohio, with my husband of 11 years, Craig. We had a dog named Biscuit, a vegetable garden neither of us properly maintained, and a mortgage we were quietly proud of. I taught elementary school. Craig worked in logistics management for a mid-sized freight company. We weren't glamorous. We were steady, or so I believed. We met in our late 20s at a mutual friend's birthday party. He was charming in that quiet, reliable way, the kind of man who remembers to bring an umbrella and holds the door without thinking about it. We dated for 2 years, got married in a small outdoor ceremony, and built what I genuinely thought was a real life together. We argued about money sometimes, about whose turn it was to call the plumber, about how often we visited his mother in Cincinnati. Normal things, marriage things. Looking back now, I can identify the exact moment the cracks began showing. I simply chose not to see them. It started about a year before my hospitalization. Craig began working late more frequently. Not dramatically so, not in a way that demanded confrontation, just enough to notice. 2 evenings a week became 3. 3 became 4. He started keeping his phone face down on the kitchen counter. He laughed differently at texts when he thought I wasn't watching, a short, private smile that he quickly erased. He started going to the gym on Saturday mornings, which was new. He bought a new cologne without mentioning it. I told myself these were the natural drifts of a long marriage. People change their habits. People want privacy. I was a school teacher who came home exhausted, and perhaps I was simply looking for reassurance in ordinary things. Then I got sick. In February, I was diagnosed with a severe gallbladder infection that required surgery and a follow-up stay for monitoring. It wasn't life-threatening, but it wasn't minor either. The doctors wanted me in hospital for at least 8 days. Craig drove me to the hospital, kissed my forehead, told me not to worry about anything at home. He visited the first 2 days. Then the visits became calls. Then the calls became shorter. By day 5, I was telling myself he was busy with work. By day 6, I was staring at the ceiling of my hospital room at 2 in the morning, wondering why I felt more alone than I had in years. It was my neighbor, Patricia Owens, who called me on day 7. Patricia was in her 60s, a retired librarian who lived 2 houses down and had known us since we moved in. She was not a gossip. That was the first thing I thought of when I saw her name on my phone screen at 7 p.m. Patricia didn't call without a reason. Her voice was careful, measured, the way someone speaks when they've rehearsed what to say. "Laura, honey, I don't know if this is my place." A pause. "But there's been a woman at your house, coming and going. Yesterday evening and again today. Craig's car was there both times. I remember the exact quality of the silence that followed. Not dramatic, just flat, like air leaving a room." I asked her to describe the woman. Patricia described someone younger, late 20s, dark hair, driving a silver Honda. She'd seen her twice, and both times Craig had walked her to the door. I thanked Patricia. I hung up. I sat with that information for approximately 4 minutes. Then I called the nursing station and told them I needed to arrange an early discharge for the following morning. The doctor on duty tried to dissuade me. I was polite and firm. I signed the necessary paperwork at 8 a.m. My friend Gwen, who knew nothing of what was happening, picked me up as a favor because I'd told her Craig was tied up at work. I didn't call Craig. I didn't text him. I sat in Gwen's passenger seat and watched the familiar streets of my neighborhood pass by, and I felt something settle inside me. Not rage, not yet, but a cold and terrible clarity. Gwen pulled into my driveway. I thanked her, said I'd call later, and waited until she pulled away. I walked to my front door. I put my key in the lock. I turned it, and I pushed the door open. The house smelled different. That was the first thing I registered. Not what I saw, but what I smelled. A perfume that wasn't mine. Something floral and sweet, hanging in the air of my own entryway, like an uninvited guest who had made themselves comfortable. I stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds. Craig was in the kitchen. I heard him before I saw him. The particular scrape of his chair on the tile floor, the sound he made every morning when he pushed back from the table. Then silence. Then footsteps. He appeared in the hallway and stopped. The look on his face was not guilt exactly. It was something worse. It was calculation. In the fraction of a second before his expression rearranged itself into concern, I saw him assess the situation. I saw him deciding what to say. "Laura, you're home. Why didn't you call?" I looked past him into the kitchen, a second coffee mug on the table, still steaming. "Whose cup is that?" I asked. He glanced back, a half second too long. "Mine. I had 2 cups this morning." I walked past him into the kitchen. I stood at the table and looked at the mug. There was a faint imprint of lip gloss on the rim, a coral pink shade I did not own. I picked up the mug. I set it back down. I turned to face him. "Craig," I said, "don't." He started talking. He talked for a long time. The woman was a colleague. She had stopped by to drop off paperwork. It was nothing. I was reading into things because I was tired and unwell, and it had been a hard week. He was worried about me. He loved me. Why hadn't I called? I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I told him I needed to lie down, that the drive home had been tiring. He looked relieved. That relief told me everything I needed to know. I went to our bedroom and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, my bed, in my house, that I had helped pay for. And I allowed myself exactly 15 minutes to feel the full weight of what was happening. 11 years. 11 years of shared grocery lists and vacation arguments and quiet Sunday mornings. 11 years of believing that what we had was, if not extraordinary, at least honest. And he had brought another woman into our home while I was lying in a hospital bed, recovering from surgery. He had let her drink coffee from my mugs. He had let her perfume settle into the curtains of my entryway. Was I surprised? I searched myself for surprise and found almost none. That was perhaps the worst part. I thought about what I stood to lose. The house, which we owned jointly, purchased 8 years ago, now worth considerably more than we'd paid. My financial stability. We had a joint account, joint savings, shared investments. My sense of home, my sense of self. The carefully constructed life I had spent more than a decade building. And then I thought about something my mother told me once, after her own divorce when I was 12. She had been crying in the kitchen, thinking I was asleep. When she noticed me in the doorway, she wiped her face and said very quietly, "The worst thing you can do when someone steals from you is let them keep the house too." I hadn't understood that then. I understood it now. I did not cry. I made a mental list. I needed documentation. I needed to understand exactly what our assets were and where they stood. I needed legal advice before Craig had any idea I was considering it. I needed to move carefully, because the moment he suspected I was building a case, he would begin protecting himself. And he was not a stupid man. I also needed to know who she was. Patricia had given me a description: late 20s, dark hair, silver Honda. Craig worked at Meridian Freight Solutions on the east side of Columbus. He had mentioned once or twice a woman named Danielle in his department. In passing, the way you mention someone unremarkable. I had not thought twice about it. I thought twice about it now. That evening, I was quiet and pleasant over dinner. I asked Craig about his week. I listened. I laughed once at something he said. He visibly relaxed. He thought the crisis had passed. He thought I had accepted his explanation. He was wrong. That night, after he fell asleep, I lay in the dark with my eyes open, and I began, quietly and methodically, to plan. The next morning, I woke up before Craig and made coffee. I stood at the kitchen counter, the same counter where a second mug had been sitting the day before, and I wrote a list on the back of a grocery receipt. It wasn't dramatic. It looked like an errand list. In a way, it was. Step 1. Find a family law attorney. Step 2. Access and photograph all financial documents. Step 3. Confirm identity of the woman. Craig came downstairs at 7:15, kissed me on the top of my head, and told me he was glad I was home. I smiled and told him his coffee was ready. I waited until he left for work. Then I went to the filing cabinet in the home office, the one we both used, where we kept tax returns, mortgage documents, bank statements, insurance policies. I photographed every page with my phone, property records, joint account history for the past 18 months, his most recent pay stubs, which I hadn't looked at in over a year, his 401k documentation, 2 credit card statements in his name alone, which I had not known existed. Those 2 credit card statements stopped me. I sat down at the desk and went through them carefully. Restaurant charges. Not the kinds of places Craig and I went together. A hotel stay in March, when he had told me he was at a logistics conference in Dayton. Flower delivery in January. Concert tickets in November to a show I had never heard about. I photographed everything. Then I drove to a UPS store on the other side of town, printed the photographs, and put them in a manila envelope. I did not bring them home. I had been given the name of a family law attorney by a teacher at my school, whose sister had gone through a difficult divorce 2 years prior. Her name was Ellen Marsh, and her office was in a quiet building near downtown Columbus. I called from my car and made an appointment for the following Thursday, giving a different callback number, my old cell phone that I kept as a backup. I did not tell Craig. The days that followed had a strange double quality. On the surface, our home life continued almost normally. I cooked dinner. We watched television. He asked how I was feeling, and I said better, which was technically true in one sense and profoundly false in another. But underneath, I was moving. I was building something. It was on the 4th day that Craig's behavior changed. Not dramatically, just enough. He started coming home earlier, watching me more. He picked up his phone and then set it down when I entered the room, which was actually the opposite of his previous behavior. And once, when I mentioned offhandedly that I'd driven across town for a prescription, something moved behind his eyes. A small, sharp attention. I think someone had warned him. I found out who on day 6. I had driven to Meridian Freight Solutions at lunchtime. Not to confront anyone, simply to look. I parked across the street and waited. At 12:40, Craig came out of the building with a woman. She matched Patricia's description exactly. Dark hair, late 20s, wearing a green jacket. They stood close together in the parking lot, not touching, but close. She said something. He nodded. Then he took out his phone and showed her something on the screen. I took photographs from my car. Then she looked up. Not at me, just out across the parking lot. And I saw her face clearly for the first time. I looked her up that evening on LinkedIn using Craig's laptop while he showered. It took 4 minutes. Danielle Reeves, 29, Operations Coordinator at Meridian Freight Solutions. Her profile photo matched the woman in the parking lot exactly. Danielle Reeves had been working at Craig's company for 2 years. I thought about January, the flowers, the concert tickets, the hotel in March. Then I thought about February, the exact month I had been hospitalized. I sat at Craig's desk in the home office and I understood with a cold and absolute certainty that this had not been a recent lapse in judgment or a moment of weakness. This had been going on for a long time. I had been ill in a hospital bed, and he had been bringing her into our home, into our bed, for all I knew. I closed the laptop and went to the kitchen to wash the dishes. My hands were steady. I had everything I needed for Thursday. The point of no return had arrived, and I had crossed it quietly, without ceremony, while Craig watched television in the next room. Thursday came. I told Craig I had a follow-up appointment with my doctor, which was partially true. I did have a checkup that week, just not on that particular morning. I drove to Ellen Marsh's office with my manila envelope and sat in her clean, quiet waiting room for 12 minutes before she called me in. Ellen Marsh was in her mid-50s, precise and unhurried. She wore reading glasses on a chain and took notes by hand. I laid out everything on her desk: the photographed financial documents, the credit card statements, the hotel receipt, the photographs from the parking lot, Patricia's account, the timeline. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked several questions. About the mortgage, about how it was titled, about whether I had my own income, about children. We had no children. The house was titled jointly. My teacher's salary was consistent and documented. She set down her pen. "You've done thorough preliminary work," she said. "That's going to help you." We discussed the strategy. Ohio is an equitable distribution state, meaning marital assets are divided fairly, not necessarily equally, but fairly, given contributions from both parties. Given that I had documented evidence of dissipation of marital assets, Craig's secret credit cards, the hotel, the gifts, that would factor into the division. She advised me to open a separate bank account immediately, to transfer my direct deposit, and to make no sudden large movements from the joint account. I followed every instruction within 48 hours. I didn't yet know how Craig found out. Perhaps it was a call to the bank about the account changes. Perhaps Danielle had contacts. Perhaps he simply noticed I was no longer accessing the joint account. Whatever the cause, on Saturday evening, 5 days after my meeting with Ellen, Craig came home with a different face. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said very quietly, "I know you've been to a lawyer, Laura." I said nothing. He spoke for several minutes. The tone was measured, but the content was threatening, wrapped carefully in the language of concern and disappointment, the way certain people deliver ultimatums. He said that if I pursued this, I would find that the house was more complicated than I thought. He had a friend in real estate. He knew people. He suggested that fighting him would cost me more than cooperating would. I recognized the tactic. It was leverage through vagueness, implying power without specifying it, hoping fear would fill in the blanks. 2 days later, Danielle called my cell phone. I don't know how she got the number. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was composed but unmistakable. She said she cared about Craig, that they had something real, and that she hoped I would think carefully before making things ugly. She said she wasn't going anywhere. I played the voicemail for Ellen Marsh the next morning and asked her to add it to my file. The following week, Craig escalated further. He told me he had consulted his own attorney and that they were prepared to argue I had been emotionally absent for years, that the marriage had been effectively over long before Danielle, and that any claims I made about dissipation of assets would be contested vigorously. That evening, I sat across from him at the dinner table and I said, "Craig, I have 11 years of joint tax returns, a mortgage in both our names, and photographs of you and Danielle at your workplace taken 6 days ago. I have a voicemail from her on my phone from last Tuesday. My attorney has copies of all of it. So does my email." He stared at me. I stood up, picked up my plate, and went to wash it in the sink. The threats stopped after that. Not permanently, but they stopped for the moment. Craig grew quiet. Danielle did not call again. The house settled into a strange, cold stalemate. I moved through it without showing the cost. But the cost was real. The sleeplessness, the hyper-awareness, the way I had started checking the locks twice at night. It was accumulating. After the confrontation, I told Ellen I needed a few days before we moved to the next phase. She agreed it was wise. I drove to my sister's house in Cleveland for a long weekend. I slept for 11 hours the first night. I walked by the lake. I ate food that someone else cooked. When I drove back to Columbus on Monday morning, I was not healed, but I was ready. When I returned from Cleveland, the house was very clean. Craig had done the dishes, vacuumed, and put fresh flowers, white tulips, on the kitchen table. The gesture was so deliberate that it almost made me laugh. After everything, after the hotel receipts and the coffee mug and Danielle's voicemail still sitting in my phone like a small, venomous artifact. White tulips. He had dinner on the stove. He asked how the drive was. He was careful, solicitous, and entirely transparent. I understood immediately what this was. It wasn't remorse. It was strategy. Over the following days, Craig began what I can only describe as a campaign of reconsideration. He was home every evening. He asked about my day. He suggested we go to dinner, revisit a restaurant we'd liked early in our marriage. Once, he sat beside me on the couch and put his hand near mine, not quite touching, just available, and said quietly that he had made a terrible mistake, that he had been going through something he couldn't explain, and that he would do whatever it took. I watched him while he spoke. I thought about the photographs on my phone. I thought about February, the surgery, the IV drip, the ceiling of my hospital room at 2 a.m, and his calls growing shorter. "I appreciate you saying that," I told him. And then I went to bed. He tried twice more that week, each time with increasing sincerity. The sincerity itself was the tell. It was performed, calibrated to increase incrementally, like a volume dial being turned up by someone watching my face for a reaction. There was no reaction for him to find. I had moved somewhere interior and quiet, where his words didn't reach me. Was I tempted? I asked myself that honestly, and the honest answer was, not by him. I was tempted by the idea of what we had been, or what I had believed we were. But that woman didn't exist anymore, and neither did that marriage. You cannot be tempted by something that no longer exists. Meanwhile, Danielle was quiet. No calls, no messages. But Patricia told me she had seen the silver Honda parked on our street twice that week. Down the block, not directly in front of the house, but there. Watching, perhaps, or simply maintaining a presence. I noted it and moved on. What I needed now was not just legal strategy. I needed to rebuild the ground beneath me, because I had been standing on Craig's version of our life for 11 years, and that ground was gone. I needed people who were actually real. The first call I made was to my friend Gwen, the same friend who had driven me home from the hospital, who had known nothing of what was happening. I told her everything over coffee at her kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon. She didn't cry or gasp dramatically. She leaned forward, listened, and when I finished, she said, "What do you need?" Those 4 words were the most useful thing anyone said to me that month. She helped me identify a therapist, someone who specialized in marital trauma, based in Westerville. I saw her for the first time that Friday. The session was not cathartic or dramatic. It was practical and grounding. She helped me name what had happened without catastrophizing it, and she helped me understand that what I was feeling, the strange, cold calm punctuated by moments of unexpected grief, was a normal response to a genuine loss. She also referred me to a divorce support group that met on Tuesday evenings at a community center near my school. I almost didn't go. It sounded, frankly, like exactly the kind of thing I didn't want, sitting in a circle discussing feelings with strangers. But Gwen offered to drive me the first time, and I went. There were 9 people in the room, different ages, different circumstances. A man in his 60s whose wife had left after 30 years, a woman my age dealing with a custody dispute, a young man barely 30 who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Nobody performed their pain. They just described it, matter-of-factly, and listened to each other. I went back the following Tuesday, and the one after that. It didn't fix anything, but it made the walls of my situation feel less absolute, more like something people pass through rather than a place they stayed forever. That distinction mattered more than I expected. By the 3rd week of April, I had a therapist, a support group, a legal strategy, and a financial structure that Craig did not control. I also had something else, clarity. I knew exactly what I wanted, and I knew exactly how to get there. The question was no longer whether I would see it through. The question was simply, when that answer was coming. I came home on a Thursday evening to find Craig's car in the driveway and another car parked behind it, a silver Honda. I sat in my own car for a moment and looked at it. The streetlights had just come on. The neighborhood was quiet. There was something almost absurd about the scene. 2 cars in my driveway, an ambush dressed up as a conversation, and me sitting in the dark deciding how to walk into my own house. I decided to walk in exactly as I always did. They were in the living room. Craig stood near the fireplace. Danielle sat on my couch, the gray sectional I had chosen in my house, at my address, with her hands folded in her lap and an expression of practiced composure. She was younger than I'd expected in person, pretty in an uncomplicated way. She was wearing a blazer, which struck me as deliberate, as though she had dressed for a negotiation. Craig said, "Laura, please, just listen." I set my bag down on the hall table. I looked at both of them. I did not sit. He spoke first, using the voice I recognized from the previous weeks. Measured, careful, designed to sound reasonable. He said they had come together because they wanted to avoid further conflict, that things had escalated beyond what anyone had intended, that Danielle was a part of his life now, and that the most mature and adult solution was to reach an agreement outside of court. Something fair, something private, something that would let everyone move forward without additional pain. Then Danielle spoke. Her tone was careful, but the content was not. She spoke as though she were doing me a favor by being honest. She said that a court process would be painful, drawn out, and expensive, that she knew people who had been through it, and that no one came out whole. She said that Craig had already consulted an attorney who believed the asset division could be argued in numerous ways, and that I should consider whether the financial and emotional cost was worth it for an outcome that was uncertain. She said, "I know this isn't what you planned, but sometimes life goes in directions we don't expect. The question is whether you want to fight it or accept it." I looked at her for a long moment. Accept it. She was in my living room, on my couch, in my house, telling me to accept it. She had driven her silver Honda to my address and sat down in my home and was now explaining to me, with the patient condescension of someone who believes they hold all the cards, that the reasonable thing, the adult thing, would be to simply let go. I thought about everything Ellen Marsh had told me, about the asset documentation, about Craig's secret credit cards, about the hotel in March, about the voicemail, still in my phone, time-stamped and intact. "I appreciate you both coming," I said. My voice was even. "I've heard what you've said. My attorney will continue to be in contact with Craig's attorney. If there's nothing else, I need to start dinner." Danielle's composure developed a hairline fracture. She glanced at Craig, then back at me. "Laura, we're trying to make this easier for you." "I know," I said. "I don't need it made easier." Craig's tone changed. The measured quality evaporated. He said that I was being irrational, that I was letting pride cost me more than it was worth, that I would regret spending the next year of my life in litigation when I could simply take a settlement and rebuild. His voice rose slightly at the end. Not quite a shout, but close enough that it changed the texture of the room. I noticed he still didn't specify what the settlement would be. No number, no terms, just the pressure of the idea. The implication that something was being offered, without the commitment of actually offering it. "Good night," I said, and I walked to the front door and held it open. There was a silence that lasted approximately 10 seconds. Then Danielle stood, picked up her bag, and walked out. She didn't look at me as she passed. Up close, without the composed distance of the couch, she looked younger than her LinkedIn photo, and tired in a way that her blazer couldn't cover. Craig was the last to leave. At the door, he stopped and turned to face me. Something had changed in his face. The performance had dropped completely, and what was underneath was not anger exactly, but something uglier. A stripped quality. The face of a man who has run out of scripts. "You're going to regret this," he said. "Maybe," I said, and I closed the door. I stood in my entryway for a moment after they left. The house was very quiet. The tulips Craig had bought the previous week were still on the kitchen table, now wilting slightly at the edges. Then my hands started shaking. I sat down on the bottom stair and breathed through it. The fear, which was real and physical and arrived all at once now that they were gone. The threat in Craig's face at the end had been genuine. Not vague this time. Genuine. The kind of look that doesn't require elaboration. But underneath the fear, something else was burning. Because they had come here thinking they could walk into my house and talk me out of my own future. They had looked at me. A woman recovering from surgery. A woman whose husband had brought another person into her home. And they had calculated that I could be managed, softened with the right words, frightened with the right implications. They had underestimated me so completely that they had sat down on my couch and told me to accept it. That miscalculation was going to cost them. I called Ellen Marsh and left a voicemail describing what had happened, the time of arrival, who was present, what was said, the implicit threat at the door. I took notes in my phone immediately after, while the details were precise. Then I stood up, went to the kitchen, threw the wilting tulips in the trash, and started making dinner. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late May. It had taken 2 months to get there. 2 months of documentation, legal filings, financial disclosures, and a level of procedural patience that I had not known I possessed. Ellen had filed the divorce petition in April. Craig had retained an attorney, as he'd promised, a man named Dorsey, known for aggressive negotiation. They had requested mediation first. Mediation failed in the third session when Craig's financial disclosures proved incomplete. Not in a small way, in a way that required explanation. Ellen filed for formal discovery. That was when things became very serious. The discovery process required Craig to disclose all assets, debts, income, and expenditures for the duration of the marriage. Craig and his attorney, I think, believed this would be straightforward, that they could control the narrative, present a version of the finances that minimized his liabilities and questioned mine. What they hadn't accounted for was how thorough my preparation had been, or how early I had started. Ellen subpoenaed records from both of his credit card companies. She obtained his phone carrier records. Not the content of messages, but the metadata, call frequency, timing, duration, dating back 18 months. She filed a motion regarding dissipation of marital assets, supported by the hotel receipt, the flower delivery, the concert tickets, and 18 months of credit card statements that showed a consistent, documented pattern of expenditure on a relationship he had kept entirely hidden from me. The morning of the deposition, I wore gray. I drove myself. I arrived at Ellen's office by 8 o'clock, and we reviewed the documents together for 40 minutes before walking down the hall to the conference room. I had read through everything the night before and slept adequately. My hands were steady. I sat across from Craig and his attorney Dorsey in a conference room with large windows overlooking a quiet street. Craig looked diminished. That was my first thought. He looked smaller than he had at home. Older, somehow, in the particular way that stress without resolution ages people. His attorney Dorsey was a broad man who took up physical space confidently, shuffling papers with the performative briskness of someone who charges by the hour. He opened with a procedural objection that went nowhere and then settled into the questions. Danielle was not present. She had been subpoenaed separately for later in the week. The deposition proceeded. Dorsey had a strategy, and it was the one Craig had telegraphed weeks ago. Argue that the marriage had been deteriorating for years, that the relationship with Danielle had begun only after the marriage was effectively over, that my claims of dissipation were exaggerated and selectively presented. But the records didn't support that story. Ellen walked him through the credit card statements line by line, methodically, without theatrics. The hotel in March. Craig attempted to claim it was a work trip. Ellen produced the hotel's records, subpoenaed earlier that week. The booking was made through a personal account. The room was registered under Craig's name and listed 2 occupants, and the dates corresponded with a weekend I had specifically remembered because I had been home alone with a cold, and he had told me he was in Dayton for a regional conference. I remembered that weekend clearly. I had ordered soup delivery and watched a documentary and texted him twice. He had responded both times with short, affectionate messages. He had been in a hotel with Danielle Reeves while I was sick, at home sending him texts. When the hotel documentation appeared on the table, something happened to Craig's face. It didn't collapse. It simply stopped. The careful management he had maintained for 2 months, the cultivated reasonableness, the plausible deniability, the practiced performance of a wronged man who had simply made a human mistake, stopped working. His attorney objected twice. The objections were noted and overruled. The questions continued. Ellen asked about the flower delivery in January. Craig said he didn't remember it. She placed the delivery receipt on the table, sent to a residential address in Clintonville that was not our home. She asked if he could identify the address. He looked at his attorney. His attorney made a note. She asked about a Venmo transaction from the previous November, $340 to an account registered under the name D. Reeves. She asked him directly what that payment was for. Craig said it was a professional expense. Ellen asked him to explain in specific terms what professional service Danielle Reeves had provided to him personally in November, and whether that service appeared anywhere in his business expense records. Dorsey intervened. They requested a short break. During the break, I sat in the hallway with a paper cup of water and looked out at the street below. A delivery truck was parking. A woman walked a small dog past the building entrance. Life, proceeding entirely indifferent to what was happening on the fourth floor. I found that comforting, in a strange way. I was not triumphant sitting in that hallway. I was not angry. I was something quieter than either. A woman who had done the necessary thing and was watching it resolve into its natural shape. When we returned, Dorsey's manner had changed. The aggression was still present, but it had become defensive, a posture that occupied the same space as confidence, but was recognizably different. He was protecting a weakened position, and experienced people in conference rooms know what that looks like. They made an offer before the deposition concluded. It was not a good one. Still tilted heavily in Craig's favor, structured to minimize his financial exposure and frame the house as an asset requiring forced sale. Ellen told me quietly that it was a starting position, not a real offer. A placeholder. I declined it without deliberation. On Thursday, Danielle appeared for her own deposition. She arrived with a personal attorney. Not Dorsey, someone else, younger. She had dressed carefully again, but in the room, under direct questioning, the composure she had worn in my living room, the blazer, the folded hands, the patient voice explaining that I should simply accept things, did not hold. She was asked directly, when did the relationship with Craig Hendricks begin? She said the previous fall. Ellen placed a restaurant receipt on the table. A reservation made in Craig's name, a charge for two on his personal credit card, on an evening 11 months before the date Danielle had just given. An evening I remembered because I had been at a school fundraiser and had come home to an empty house and assumed Craig was working late. Danielle looked at the receipt. She looked at her attorney. She looked at the surface of the table. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. She did not speak. She didn't need to. The answer was already in the room, sitting on the table in the form of a dated restaurant receipt and 18 months of documented evidence. Everything they had constructed, the story, the timeline, the version of events in which Craig's choices were understandable and my response was excessive, had come apart quietly, in a conference room, under the weight of things I had photographed on an ordinary Tuesday morning while Craig was at work. The settlement was finalized on a Friday in late June. I remember the day precisely. Gray sky, warm air, the smell of cut grass drifting in from somewhere outside the office building where Ellen and I sat across a long conference table from Craig and Dorsey. It had been 4 months since I had opened my front door and walked back into my life. It felt both longer and shorter than that, in the way that periods of high intensity compress and expand time simultaneously. What happened in those final weeks, after the depositions, was not dramatic. It was procedural and relentless, which I had come to understand was often how real victories arrived. Not in a single decisive moment, but in the accumulated weight of documented fact presented consistently by someone who had prepared for longer than the other side anticipated. Craig's attorney had presented 2 more settlement offers after the deposition. The first arrived within a week, marginally better than the one rejected in the conference room, but still structured to protect Craig's primary financial interests at my expense. The second, 3 weeks later, showed genuine movement. The tone had shifted from defensive assertion to cautious negotiation, which told me that Dorsey had had a frank conversation with his client about the strength of their position. Ellen and I reviewed each offer carefully. We identified what remained insufficient, documented our reasoning, and responded in writing with specific counter-proposals supported by financial figures and legal precedent. We did not rush. We did not negotiate emotionally. We negotiated with paper. Craig eventually understood that there was no version of this process in which I disappeared or gave up or decided it was too exhausting to continue. The final settlement gave me the house. This had been the central and most contested point from the beginning. Craig and Dorsey had argued consistently that a forced sale and equal split of proceeds was the only equitable resolution, that neither party could claim the house over the other. Ellen had argued, with full documentation, that I had contributed equally to the mortgage across all 11 years, that my income as a teacher had been consistent and verifiable throughout the marriage, and that Craig's dissipation of marital assets, the hotels, the gifts, the hidden credit cards, represented a direct and quantifiable financial harm that warranted compensatory consideration in the asset division. The judge reviewing the preliminary settlement terms agreed with our framing. I kept the house. Craig was given 60 days to remove his belongings and cooperate with the title transfer. I was awarded 55% of the joint savings and investment accounts. The dissipation documentation had done exactly what Ellen predicted when I first laid the photographs on her desk 4 months earlier. It established a clear, consistent, time-stamped pattern of marital funds being directed toward a concealed relationship. That pattern had legal weight, and the settlement reflected it. Craig retained his 401k, his vehicle, and his personal accounts. He walked away from 11 years of marriage with considerably less than he had entered the process expecting, and with a legal record that documented why. His attorney's fees, I was told through the grapevine, were substantial. I signed the final documents at 2:17 p.m. Ellen notarized them. I had brought a pen from home. A specific pen, a good one, that I had bought for myself the week I opened my separate bank account. A small, private gesture that no one else knew the significance of. I used it to sign my name on every page. We shook hands in Ellen's office afterward. She said, without sentimentality, "You handled this well." I thanked her genuinely. She had been precise, steady, and honest with me across 4 months of a process that required all 3 qualities. I left her office carrying the settlement documents in a manila folder, the same kind of folder I had used to store the photographs at the UPS store back in March, when all of this was still just a plan. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a few minutes. I had expected to feel triumphant. I didn't exactly. What I felt was more specific than triumph. It was the particular solidity of a foundation that has been tested and held. For 4 months, I had been building under pressure, operating carefully in a situation designed to destabilize me. Now the building was done, and the ground was firm. The practical aftermath continued through July. Craig came to retrieve his belongings on a Saturday morning while I was at Gwen's house, as arranged through our attorneys. No contact required, no overlap. He took the living room television, the outdoor furniture, the espresso machine, several framed prints. He left the gray sectional couch, the same couch Danielle had sat on, in my house, uninvited, explaining to me that I should accept things. I had it professionally cleaned. I kept it, because it was a well-made couch and I had chosen it, and it belonged to me. Patricia came by that same Saturday evening with a casserole dish and a bottle of wine that was better than the occasion strictly required. We sat on the back porch in the July warmth, and she didn't ask me how I felt or deliver a speech about moving forward. She just sat with me, and at one point said quietly, "I'm sorry I didn't call you sooner." I told her that calling me when she did was the thing that changed everything, which was true. The title transfer was completed in August. My name alone on the mortgage. My name on the deed. my house. I stood in the kitchen the evening the paperwork was finalized and looked around at the space. The slightly dated cabinets I was already planning to replace, the window above the sink where the afternoon light came in at an angle I had always loved. And I thought, this is mine, not ours, not his, not a shared compromise or a negotiated neutral space. Mine, earned twice. Once when I helped pay for it, and again when I refused to give it up. That felt like enough, more than enough. It felt, in fact, like a beginning. By October, I had repainted the bedroom. It sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. For 11 years, the bedroom walls had been a shade of beige that Craig had chosen from a paint swatch in 2014. I had never particularly liked it. I had accepted it the way I had accepted many small things over the course of the marriage. Quietly, without examining whether acceptance was actually what I wanted. I had confused compromise with erasure, and I had been doing it for so long that I had stopped noticing. I chose a deep, muted blue. I painted it myself over a long weekend with Gwen's help and a playlist she made, a mix of things that were too loud and too cheerful and exactly right for the occasion. We painted badly at first, fixed it, laughed about it, and painted better. When it was done and the furniture was back in place, and the room smelled of fresh paint drying in the October light, I stood in the doorway and felt something so ordinary and so complete that I didn't have a name for it at first. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was agency. The specific satisfaction of a space that reflected, for the first time in years, exclusively my own choices. No negotiation, no compromise. Just the color I had wanted, on the walls of my room, in my house. The months that followed were not effortless. Divorce never erases cleanly. It leaves paperwork and awkward silences, and the occasional intrusion of memory at unexpected moments. I still had days when the loss arrived sideways and caught me without preparation. Not the loss of Craig specifically, but the loss of the version of my life I had believed in. Grief for a fiction is still grief. I had learned not to argue with it, just to let it move through and keep going. But the ground held. Every time I tested it, it held. I continued seeing my therapist through the winter. Sessions that were less about crisis management now and more about reconstruction. Understanding the patterns. Learning to distinguish between genuine compromise and the kind of slow self-erasure I had practiced for years. It was careful, unglamorous work. It mattered enormously. I continued attending the Tuesday group, which had evolved from a place of acute need into something more like a community. People I had come to know through the shared experience of reassembling themselves after something had broken. Robert, the man in his 60s, had started a garden and brought photographs one Tuesday in November that made everyone lean forward to look. The young man who had barely slept when I first met him was now sleeping, had adopted a dog, and occasionally made the rest of us laugh with a dry humor that had clearly been there all along, waiting for steadier ground to emerge on. In November, I began the kitchen renovation I had been planning since August. I refinanced the mortgage in my name alone, a process that required documentation, patience, and a solid credit history that I had maintained throughout the marriage without fully realizing it was mine independently. The bank approved it without difficulty. The contractor I hired, a woman named Sandra, finished the work in 3 weeks, did not overcharge me, and did not underestimate what I wanted. I cooked dinner in the new kitchen on a Thursday evening in early December. The light was different, warmer, more open. I stood at the counter with a glass of wine and thought simply, yes, this. Now, Craig and Danielle. I want to be accurate here because accuracy matters more to me than a satisfying story. I heard things through the channels that mid-sized cities reliably provide. Mutual acquaintances, Patricia and Gwen, who reported back with the careful, neutral tone of someone who understands the difference between information and gloating. Craig and Danielle had moved in together in August, into an apartment on the east side of Columbus. By September, there were reports of friction, the ordinary, corrosive kind that emerges when a relationship sustained by secrecy is suddenly required to function in full daylight. The things that made it exciting, the hiddenness, the urgency, the sense of something stolen, don't survive grocery lists and bill splitting and questions about whose turn it is to call the landlord. In October, Craig was passed over for a promotion at Meridian. Their relationship, once generally known among colleagues, had not made either of them easier to manage professionally. These things have a way of compounding quietly. By December, someone mentioned in passing that Craig and Danielle were going through a difficult period. No elaboration offered, none requested. I did not feel triumphant. What I felt was something quieter, a recognition that certain choices carry their own weight, and that weight arrives on its own schedule, without requiring my involvement. What I felt clearly was the difference between their situation and mine. I was sleeping well. My classroom had its strongest year in recent memory. Biscuit learned a new trick involving dramatically collapsing whenever I pointed at him, which became a reliable source of delight during a school visit in February. In March, exactly 1 year after I had driven home in Gwen's car, with a cold certainty settling in my chest, I went on a weekend trip to the Hocking Hills with Gwen and 2 women from the Tuesday group. We hiked, ate too much food around a fire, and laughed at things that weren't even particularly funny. The laughing felt real in the way that only unperformed laughter does. On the last morning, I sat outside the cabin in the early light with coffee and looked at the trees and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Uncomplicated contentment. Not the erasure of what had happened, not the end of difficulty. Simply, this morning, this coffee, this light, and a life that was, without qualification, without anyone else's name on it, entirely mine. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything. People talk about betrayal like it's the end of the story. It isn't. It's just the moment you find out who you actually are. I lost a marriage. I kept a house, a dog, my integrity, and eventually, myself. Craig and Danielle chose what they chose. The rest followed naturally. I learned this: document everything. Trust your instincts. Find one person who asks, "What do you need?" And never let anyone sit on your couch and tell you to accept what you didn't agree to. What would you have done in my place? If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. It means more than you know. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for being part of Lyra Echo Stories. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every echo never truly fades.